It's April 7, 1945, and 17-year-old Klaus Hahn is diving his Messerschmitt Bf-109 straight toward a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress at over 400 miles per hour. The massive bomber fills his entire windscreen. His hands grip the control stick with white knuckles. But something is wrong. Tears are streaming down his face, freezing against his oxygen mask in the frigid air at 25,000 feet. He can see the American tail gunner frantically trying to swing his guns around. Hahn's vision blurs not from the speed or the altitude, but from the realization of what he's about to do. He's not just destroying a machine. He's trying to kill 10 men he's never met, and he knows he'll probably die doing it. This is the story of a boy who became a kamikaze pilot, not out of fanaticism, but out of desperation. A boy who cried in combat because even in the final days of the Third Reich, even trained to die for his country, he couldn't escape his own humanity. This is the story of Klaus Hahn, and the impossible choice he made 25,000 feet above Germany in the dying days of World War II. Germany is collapsing. The Third Reich that promised to last 1,000 years is crumbling after just 12. Soviet forces are pushing from the east, crushing German divisions like tin cans. American and British forces surge from the west, crossing the Rhine and driving deep into the German heartland. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, is a shadow of its former self. Most of Germany's experienced pilots are dead, captured, or burned out from years of continuous combat. Fuel is critically short. Replacement aircraft trickle from factories that are bombed daily, and every single day, the skies over Germany darken with hundreds of American heavy bombers, protected by swarms of fighters, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German cities and industrial centers. The bombing is relentless, systematic, and utterly devastating for the people on the ground. The terror is unimaginable. Air raid sirens wail multiple times a day. Families huddle in basements and shelters while the earth shakes and buildings collapse above them. Entire city blocks vanish in firestorms. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, ancient cities reduced to burning rubble. The civilian casualties mount into the hundreds of thousands. Women, children, elderly. Nobody is safe when the bombers come, and they always come. The American 8th Air Force flies during the day. The British RAF bombs at night. There is no respite, no mercy, no end in sight. For young Germans watching their world burn, the rage and helplessness is overwhelming. In this desperate moment, the Luftwaffe High Command conceives a plan so radical, it borders on madness. Sonderkommando Elbe. The name comes from the river Elbe, symbolizing a last stand for German soil. The concept is brutally simple. Volunteer pilots will deliberately ram their fighters into American bombers, using their aircraft as weapons when bullets and missiles have failed. It's the European equivalent of the Japanese kamikaze, born from the same terrible arithmetic. Germany doesn't have enough experienced pilots, enough ammunition, enough fuel, or enough time to win through conventional means. But they have hundreds of young men willing to die for the fatherland. And they have just enough aircraft to make one last, desperate gesture. But there's a critical difference from the kamikaze. The German High Command, even in their desperation, can't quite bring themselves to order suicide missions. The official line is that pilots should ram the bombers, then bail out and parachute to safety. They're told to aim for the bomber's tail section, the weakest point, furthest from the fuel tanks, giving the fighter pilot the best chance of survival after impact. The aircraft assigned to Sonderkommando Elbe are old, worn-out Bf-109s pulled from training schools and repair depots. Most have minimal ammunition, just enough for a few bursts to clear away enemy fighters. They're expendable machines for what everyone knows, despite the official story, is likely an expendable mission. But still, the recruits are told they have a chance. It's not suicide. It's a desperate tactic with an escape plan. Klaus Hahn is 17 years old when he volunteers for Sonderkommando Elbe. He's not a hardened Nazi fanatic. He's not even a skilled pilot. He's a boy who watched American bombers turn his hometown into an inferno. He remembers hiding in a shelter while the building above shook and crumbled. He remembers emerging to find his street gone, replaced by smoking craters and burning debris. He remembers the bodies of neighbors, of children he'd played with, of old women who'd never hurt anyone, lying broken in the rubble. The trauma and rage of those moments drove him to recruitment centers, demanding to do something, anything, to make the bombers stop. Hitler youth leaders were more than happy to channel that rage into service. The training is minimal. There isn't time for proper flight instruction. Most Sonderkommando Elbe pilots have less than 50 hours of flight time. They learn basic takeoff, basic flight controls, basic navigation. They practice aiming their aircraft at ground targets, pulling up at the last second. The instructors tell them where to aim on a B-17. the vertical stabilizer, the rudder assembly, the tail section. Hit there and the bomber becomes uncontrollable. Hit there and you might survive the impact. Hit there and bail out. That's the theory. The reality, everyone knows but nobody says, is that ramming a 4-engine bomber at 400 miles per hour is almost certainly fatal. But Germany needs heroes. Germany needs hope. Germany needs something to slow down the relentless bomber streams that are pulverizing the Reich into dust. April 7th, 1945. The day of the Sonderkommando Elbe's first and only major operation. Approximately 150 volunteer pilots gather at airfields across Germany. Most are teenagers. Many have never fired their guns in combat. Some have never even seen an enemy aircraft up close. They're briefed on their mission. Massive formations of American B-17s and B-24s are heading toward German industrial targets. The volunteers are to take off, climb to altitude, locate the bomber formations, and ram them. After ramming, bail out immediately. Survive if you can. Die if you must. But bring down those bombers. Protect the fatherland. Stop the bombs from falling on German homes. This is your duty. This is your honor. This is your chance to be remembered as heroes. Hahn climbs into his assigned Bf-109. The aircraft is old, worn, with patches of mismatched paint where repairs have been made. The cockpit smells of oil and metal and fear sweat from previous pilots. He checks his instruments with trembling hands. Fuel. Barely enough for one sortie. Ammunition. Just 60 rounds per gun, enough for a few seconds of firing. Oxygen. Functional. Radio. Working. He straps himself in, feeling the weight of his parachute against his back. That parachute is his lifeline, his only hope of survival after he completes his mission. If he completes his mission, if he doesn't freeze, if he doesn't turn back, if he doesn't lose his nerve at the last second. The engine coughs to life, filling the cockpit with noise and vibration. The takeoff is chaotic. Over 100 fighters scrambling into the air simultaneously, climbing toward the bomber streams. Hahn follows his squadron leader, struggling to maintain formation. His flying is rough, uncertain. He's never flown in combat before, never had enemy fighters trying to kill him, never faced the reality that in the next hour he might be dead. The radio crackles with confused chatter. Pilots reporting enemy contacts, pilots losing sight of their leaders, pilots requesting vectors to the bombers, and then disaster. American P-51 Mustang fighters, escorting the bombers, tear into the German formation. The sky erupts in tracer fire and screaming engines. Hahn's squadron scatters. One moment he's in formation, the next he's alone in the sky. Mustangs swirling around him like angry hornets. He banks hard, trying to evade, but his skills are inadequate. The first burst of American .50 caliber fire punches through his wing, tearing metal. He dives, pulls up, tries every evasion maneuver he was taught in his brief training. It's not enough. Another burst stitches across his fuselage. Something strikes his arm with tremendous force. For a moment he feels nothing, then pain explodes through his shoulder. He looks down and sees blood soaking his flight suit. His left arm hangs useless, unresponsive. Panic surges through him. He knows he should bail out. The mission is already a failure. He's wounded, alone, his aircraft damaged. But through a gap in the clouds below, he sees them. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, flying in perfect combat box formation. Their 4 engines droning steadily as they carry their payloads of death toward German cities. The sight triggers something primal in Hahn. All the rage, all the grief, all the desperate need to do something, anything, to make it stop, comes flooding back. His home in flames, the bodies in the rubble, the endless nights in shelters while the city burned above. He makes his decision. He rolls his damaged Bf-109 into a dive, pointing the nose directly at the bomber formation below. The dive accelerates rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The wind screams over the damaged aircraft. Blood from his wounded arm spatters across the instrument panel. His vision narrows to a tunnel focused on a single B-17 in the center of the formation. He can see every detail now. The olive drab paint, the white star in its circle on the fuselage, the serial numbers, the gun turret swiveling to track him. And in that moment, as he plummets toward his target at suicidal speed, Klaus Hahn begins to cry. The tears come suddenly, overwhelmingly, born from a realization that crashes over him with more force than any enemy fire. There are men in that bomber, real men. Americans, yes, but men with families, with mothers and fathers, with sweethearts waiting for them back home. Men who probably joined up for the same reasons he did. Duty, fear, pressure, the belief that they were doing the right thing. Men who are just following orders, just trying to survive this war, just wanting to go home. And he's about to kill them all. Not with bullets from a safe distance, not with impersonal missiles, but by physically smashing his aircraft into theirs in the most brutal, intimate way possible. He's about to become a murderer, a killer. And the worst part, the part that makes the tears stream faster, is that he can't stop himself. The dive is too steep. The speed is too great. His wounded arm makes pulling out almost impossible. And even if he could pull out, what then? Return to base in shame? Face his commanders and tell them he couldn't do it? Watch the bombers continue to destroy his country? No. The tears flow, but the dive continues. Inside the B-17, Staff Sergeant William Bill Morrison is in the tailgun position, the most isolated and vulnerable spot on the bomber. He's 19 years old, from a small town in Ohio, flying his 18th combat mission over Germany. He's tracking a formation of German fighters harassing the bomber stream when one Bf-109 suddenly breaks from the pack and noses over into a nearly vertical dive directly toward his aircraft. At first, Morrison thinks it's a standard attack run. He swings his twin .50 caliber machine guns around, trying to get a bead on the rapidly approaching fighter. But something is wrong. The German isn't firing, isn't maneuvering, just diving straight as an arrow directly at Morrison's tail section. Understanding dawns with horrifying clarity. "We got a rammer! We got a rammer incoming!" he screams into his intercom. Up in the cockpit, Captain James "Jim" Hendricks, the aircraft commander, keys his mic. "Morrison, take him out." Morrison's guns hammer, spitting tracers toward the diving Bf-109. Some rounds hit, sparking off the German fighter's wings and fuselage, but it doesn't slow down, doesn't deviate, doesn't stop, just keeps coming, growing larger in Morrison's sight every second. "He's not breaking off! He's not breaking off!" Morrison screams, still firing, knowing with absolute certainty that in the next few seconds, either the German pilot will die or he will, and possibly both. His guns jam, out of ammunition. The Bf-109 fills his entire field of view. Morrison makes the sign of the cross and braces for impact. Klaus Hahn, tears still streaming, frozen against his oxygen mask, sees the tail gunners. Weapons go silent. He's close enough now to see the gunner's face, distorted through the plexiglass, sees the American's eyes wide with terror. For a fragment of a second, their eyes meet. Two teenagers, both terrified, both trapped in a moment neither wanted, both victims of a war that's already lost. Then physics takes over. The Bf-109's propeller chews into the B-17's vertical stabilizer. Metal screams against metal. The fighter's engine tears through aluminum like tissue paper. The impact is devastating. Cataclysmic, unimaginable violence as two aircraft weighing tons collide at hundreds of miles per hour. Hahn's world becomes noise, spinning, crushing force, darkness. The B-17 shudders like it's been hit by a mountain. The entire tail section tears away. Morrison's gun position simply ceases to exist, ripped from the aircraft in a spray of debris and twisted metal. The tail gunner, by some miracle, is thrown backward into the waist section of the aircraft, instead of out into space, slamming into the waist gunner and both men crashing in a tangle of limbs and equipment. The bomber lurches violently, nose dropping, entering an uncontrolled dive. Hendricks hauls back on the control yoke. Nothing. The elevator controls are gone, severed by the impact. The rudder is gone. He has ailerons and throttles and nothing else. "We're going down!" Someone screams over the intercom. "Prepare to bail out!" But Hendricks is a stubborn man, a skilled pilot. He's fought through flak and fighters and mechanical failures to bring his crew home from 17 previous missions. He's not giving up now. "Belay that!" he barks. "I've still got engines!" He starts experimenting, adjusting throttles, using differential power on the four right Cyclone engines to try to stabilize the dying bomber. Port engines to full power, starboard engines to idle. The bomber, bleeding debris and parts, slowly begins to respond. The dive shallows. The aircraft levels, more or less. It's a barely controlled flight, an aerodynamic nightmare, but they're not falling straight down anymore. "Damage report," Hendricks demands. The crew checks in one by one. Bombardier, okay. Navigator, okay. Top turret gunner, okay. Radio operator, okay. Ball turret gunner, shaken but okay. Waist gunners and Morrison, bruised and bloodied but alive. Nobody dead. It's a miracle. But the B-17 is crippled. The entire tail section aft of the waist gun positions is gone. They're flying a bomber without a tail, without directional control, held in the air by Hendricks' skill and the raw power of four engines working in careful, delicate balance. "We're heading home," Hendricks announces. "Hold on, boys. This is going to be rough." Klaus Hahn regains consciousness falling through empty sky. He has no memory of escaping his aircraft, no memory of the collision itself beyond a flash of impact and noise. He's tumbling, spinning, the ground and sky, exchanging places repeatedly. Training kicks in through the fog of shock. Don't pull the ripcord too high. Enemy fighters might shoot parachutists. Wait. The altimeter on his wrist spins down. 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. His left arm is still useless, hanging limp, but his right hand finds the ripcord. 8,000 feet. He pulls. The parachute deploys with a bone-jarring snap, jerking him upright. The sudden deceleration makes his wounded arm scream in agony. He looks down at the injury for the first time and feels sick. His entire left sleeve is soaked in blood. Something white, bone, is visible through the torn fabric. As he drifts down through the cold April air, the adrenaline begins to wear off, and the reality of what he's done settles over him like a shroud. He doesn't feel like a hero. He doesn't feel proud. He feels like a murderer. He cries again, openly now, his sobs lost in the wind. He doesn't know if the American crew survived. He assumes they didn't. Assumes he killed 10 men. The thought makes him want to vomit. This wasn't supposed to be what war felt like. The propaganda, the speeches, the promises of honor and glory, none of it prepared him for the reality of looking into another human being's eyes and then killing them. He drifts down toward the German countryside, toward whatever fate awaits him, no longer certain if he deserves to survive. Hahn lands hard in a field outside Münster, his parachute dragging him, several meters before he manages to release it with his one functioning hand. He tries to stand and immediately collapses from blood loss and shock. German soldiers find him within an hour, attracted by the parachute. They rush him to a military hospital in Münster. The doctors take one look at his mangled left arm and shake their heads. The damage is catastrophic. Bone shattered, nerves severed, massive tissue destruction, severe infection already setting in. They have limited supplies, limited time, a hospital overwhelmed with casualties from the collapsing fronts. The decision is quick and brutal. The arm must come off at the shoulder. Hahn barely understands what they're telling him before the anesthesia takes him under. He wakes up the next day in a recovery ward, his left side ending in bandages where his arm used to be. A nurse tells him the surgery went well, that he's lucky to be alive, that he's a hero of the Reich. He doesn't feel lucky, doesn't feel like a hero. He's 17 years old, mutilated, haunted by the memory of a terrified American tail gunner's eyes in the instant before impact. He learns that the Sonderkommando Elbe operation was both a tactical failure and a Pyrrhic success. About 150 pilots took off. Only about 20 made successful ramming attacks. 8 German pilots confirmed killed. At least 6 more missing. The American losses, between 8 to 24 bombers damaged or destroyed, depending on which reports you believe. Not nearly enough to make a strategic difference. Not nearly enough to stop the bomber offensive. Not nearly enough to matter. The war would be over in a month. 300 miles away, Captain Hendricks manages to coax his crippled B-17 back across the front lines and toward Allied-controlled territory. It's the most demanding flying of his life. Every air current threatens to upset the delicate balance. Every course correction requires careful, minute adjustments to 4 engine throttles. His co-pilot watches the instruments while Hendricks flies by feel, by instinct, by sheer determination. After 2 hours of white-knuckle flying, they spot an emergency airfield in Belgium. Hendricks makes one pass to show the ground crews his damage, then sets up for an approach. The landing is controlled chaos, the bomber touching down at high speed, Hendricks using throttles instead of rudder and elevator to keep them vaguely straight, the brakes screaming, the aircraft shuddering, but they make it. All 10 crew members walk away from the aircraft, alive, impossibly miraculously alive. The remains of Hahn's Bf-109 are found scattered across the German countryside. Investigators piece together what they can from the wreckage. The aircraft was old, poorly maintained, barely airworthy. The throttle was stuck, partially explaining why Hahn couldn't pull out of his dive. The ammunition counter shows he fired fewer than 20 rounds, probably at the American fighters that wounded him. The cockpit area shows extensive bloodstaining. The pilot clearly bailed out or was thrown clear in the collision. Reports filter through intelligence channels. A young German pilot, severely wounded, captured near Münster, claiming to have rammed an American bomber. His story is filed away in archives, one more footnote in a war filled with horrors. Germany surrenders on May 8, 1945. Klaus Hahn is still in the hospital in Münster when the news comes. The war he sacrificed his arm for, the war he became a killer for, is over, and Germany lost, completely, utterly, unconditionally defeated. The Third Reich that promised 1,000 years lasted 12. The bomber offensive he tried to stop continued unabated right up until the surrender. Nothing he did mattered. His sacrifice meant nothing. The men he probably killed died for nothing. He lies in his hospital bed, a one-armed 17-year-old in a destroyed country, and wonders what possible future exists for someone like him. Captain Hendricks and his crew are rotated home shortly after their miraculous survival. They're celebrated, given medals, lauded for their skill and bravery. But Hendricks is haunted by the same questions as Hahn, just from the opposite side. Who was the German pilot? Why did he ram them? Did he survive? The violence of that moment, the intimacy of that attack, stays with Hendricks for the rest of his life. He tries to find information through official channels but gets nowhere. The military doesn't care about the identity of individual enemy pilots. The war is over. Move on. Return to normal life. But Hendricks can't forget. None of his crew can forget. Morrison, the tail gunner who should have died, who looked into the German pilot's eyes in that final second, wakes up screaming for years afterward. Klaus Hahn tries to rebuild his life in post-war Germany. It's not easy for a one-armed former Luftwaffe pilot in a country under occupation, a country racked by guilt and shame, a country trying to forget its recent past. He works whatever jobs he can find. Manual labor is difficult with one arm, but he's resourceful, determined to survive. He never speaks about his time in Sonderkommando Elbe. Never mentions the ramming attack, never tells anyone about the American tail gunner's eyes or the tears he cried while diving to kill. He buries it deep, tries to forget, tries to become a normal person in a world that no longer makes sense. He marries, has children, builds a quiet life in the shadow of his war trauma. The missing arm is visible. The missing pieces of his soul are not. For nearly 60 years, Klaus Hahn lives with the certainty that he murdered 10 Americans. For nearly 60 years, Jim Hendricks lives with the mystery of the German pilot who tried to kill him. Neither man knows the other's name. Neither knows the other survived. The war ended. The participants scattered across the globe, and the full story of that April afternoon remained fragmented, incomplete, lost in the chaos of history, until 2003. In 2003, a young German historian researching the Sonderkommando Elbe operation begins tracking down surviving participants. It's difficult work. Most of the pilots died in the operation or later in the war. Many survivors don't want to talk, ashamed of their participation in what amounted to suicide attacks. But the historian is persistent. He finds Klaus Hahn, now an elderly man in his 70s, living quietly in southern Germany. Hahn is initially reluctant, but eventually agrees to an interview. The historian asks about the mission, about the ramming, about what he remembers. Hahn describes everything, including the detail that he's never told another living soul, that he cried, that in the moment before impact, he looked into the American tail gunner's eyes and cried. The historian is fascinated. This is unprecedented. A German ramming pilot who survived, who can describe the emotional reality of the attack. He asks Hahn if he knows what happened to the American bomber. Hahn shakes his head. They're all dead. I killed them all. I've lived with that for 58 years. But the historian is thorough. He cross-references the date, the location, the bomber formation reports. He narrows down possible aircraft, and then he finds it. A B-17 from the 388th Bomb Group that limped back to base on April 7, 1945, with catastrophic tail damage from a ramming attack. All crew members survived. The historian finds this information and contacts Hahn with the news. Klaus Hahn, now 75 years old, learns that he didn't kill anyone. The Americans lived, all of them. The tail gunner whose eyes he saw, alive. The pilot who somehow flew a tailless bomber to safety, alive. The weight he's carried for nearly 6 decades, the guilt, the shame, the certainty that he's a murderer, suddenly lifts. He breaks down crying, this time tears of overwhelming relief and gratitude. The historian helps him make contact with Hendricks' family. Hendricks is still alive, now in his 80s, living in Florida. The two men exchange letters through the historian's mediation. Hahn writes about the mission, about his wounds, about the tears, about the 58 years of believing he'd killed the crew. Hendricks writes about the miraculous flight home, about the nightmares, about wondering who the German pilot was. They exchange photographs. Hahn, one-armed, elderly but with kind eyes. Hendricks, gray-haired but still strong, surrounded by grandchildren. They express to each other something beyond forgiveness, because neither man really blames the other. They were both victims, both teenagers caught in a war machine neither created, both traumatized by a moment of violence neither truly wanted. In 2004, they arranged to meet in person at a veterans reunion in Germany. The organizers facilitate the meeting carefully, aware of the emotional weight. Klaus Hahn, now 76, walks into the conference room and sees Jim Hendricks, 81, standing there. For a moment, they just stare at each other. Then Hendricks crosses the room and embraces the one-armed German pilot who tried to kill him 59 years earlier. Both men are crying. "I'm sorry," Hahn says in broken English. "I'm so sorry." Hendricks pulls back, looks him in the eyes. "You were 17. You were following orders. You were trying to protect your home. There's nothing to forgive." They talk for hours about the war, about their lives after, about the trauma they both carry, about the absurdity of two teenagers trying to kill each other on behalf of nations and ideologies they barely understood. Bill Morrison, the tail gunner, now in his late 70s, is also at the reunion. He's the one who looked directly into Hahn's eyes in that final second before impact. The meeting between them is even more charged. Morrison describes what he saw: a young pilot, tears visible even through the oxygen mask, eyes not filled with hate, but with something closer to desperation and sorrow. Hahn confirms it. "I cried," he says. "I cried because I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew you were just like me, but I couldn't stop." Morrison nods, understanding. "You gave me nightmares for 40 years, he says, "but looking at you now, I can let them go." The story becomes public. News. Organizations pick it up. The tale of the German kamikaze who cried, who survived, who lived 58 years believing he was a murderer, only to discover his victims lived. The human story beneath the historical event. The emotional truth that complicates the simple narratives of heroes and villains. Us and them, victory and defeat. Veterans from both sides respond to the story. Letters pour in. Many express similar sentiments: the trauma of surviving, the guilt of violence, the desperate need for reconciliation and understanding. The story touches something raw and real about the human cost of war that sterile historical accounts miss. Klaus Hahn lives until 2011, dying at age 83. In his final years, he speaks publicly about his experience, visiting schools, talking to young people about war and peace, about the moment he cried while diving to kill, about the 58 years of guilt and the redemption of learning his victims survived. His message is simple and consistent. War makes murderers of children, and the only winners are those who refuse to fight in the first place. But when you must fight, when you're trapped in circumstances beyond your control, never forget the humanity of your enemy. Never stop crying for what you're forced to do. The moment you stop feeling the weight of violence is the moment you become the monster the propaganda wants you to be. Jim Hendricks dies in 2015 at age 92. At his funeral, his children display a photograph from 2004. Their father embracing a one-armed elderly German man, both men crying, both men smiling. The image becomes something of a symbol for reconciliation, for the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds, for the truth that the enemy is just another human being trapped in the same nightmare from a different direction. Hendricks spent his later years advocating for veterans' mental health services, speaking about PTSD before it had a name, insisting that the military must do better by the young people it sends to kill and possibly die. The historical record of Sonderkommando Elbe is clear. It was a failure, a desperate, futile gesture by a dying regime. Of approximately 150 volunteer pilots, only about 20 made successful ramming attacks. The American bombing campaign continued without pause. Germany surrendered a month later. The operation changed nothing strategically, but for the individuals involved, the German teenagers who volunteered, the American crews who survived the attacks, the families who lost sons and fathers, the survivors who carried trauma for decades, it changed everything. History records the big picture, but human beings live in the details, in the individual moments of terror and violence and impossible choices. Klaus Hahn's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even in the most justified wars, even fighting against regimes as evil as the Third Reich, the actual combat is still traumatic young people. Killing traumatic young people. The 17-year-old German pilot who cried while trying to ram a bomber was not evil. He was desperate, traumatized, manipulated by a regime that fed on his grief and rage. The American crew he attacked were not villains. They were following orders, trying to end the war, trying to survive. Both sides were right from their perspective. Both sides were victims of the same larger horror. Recognizing this doesn't change who was right and who was wrong in world war too, but it does change how we understand the humans who fought it. The tears Klaus Hahn cried at 25,000 feet over Germany on April 7, 1945, were tears of recognition. In that final second before impact, looking into Bill Morrison's terrified eyes, he saw not an enemy but a mirror, another scared kid, another victim of forces beyond his control, another human being who wanted to live, to go home, to never be in this terrible situation. The tears didn't stop the collision, didn't change the mission, didn't prevent the violence, but they preserved Hahn's humanity in a moment designed to destroy it. They kept him human even while doing something inhuman. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, that even in war's darkest moments, even when forced to violence, we can choose to remain human. We can choose to cry for what we're forced to do. We can choose to remember that the person we're trying to kill is also trying desperately to live. That recognition won't end wars, but it might help us survive them with our souls intact. Today, the wreckage of Klaus Hahn's Messerschmitt Bf 109 sits in a museum in Germany, a twisted piece of metal that tells a story of desperation, violence, trauma, and ultimate redemption. Next to it is a photograph. Two elderly men embracing, one with one arm, both crying, both smiling. Veterans from both sides visit and stand in silence before the exhibit. Some cry, some shake their heads, some reach out to touch the twisted metal, connecting with a moment of violence that happened decades before they were born. The exhibit's plaque is simple. Remember that your enemy is also human. Remember that war destroys everyone it touches. Remember that survival requires not just living through the battle, but living with what the battle made you do. Klaus Hahn cried in combat before the collision. He cried again when he learned his victim survived. And his tears, preserved in testimony and memory, remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion and recognition can survive. It's not much, but sometimes it's everything.